Dragonites are currently one of the more popular classes for dealing damage in the Elder Scrolls Online, especially for endgame hard mode trials, and in this video we'll be walking through their skills, I'll break them down, and hopefully leave you knowing the best ways to use each of them. Their first skill line is called Ardent Flame. This is primarily a damage-focused line based around flame damage skills, but there are some alternate damage types here based on the morph that you pick, and it's definitely not the only damaging line in the Dragonites kit either. DKs have a very nice spread of useful skills for DPS all throughout their 3 skill trees. So let's start with the passives. Combustion increases the damage of your burning and poison status effects by 50%. When you apply burning to an enemy, you restore 1000 magicka. When you apply poison to an enemy, you restore 1000 stamina. These effects can occur once every 3 seconds. This is definitely one of the best passives for a DK for both sustain and damage. Burning and poisoned are already very nice damaging status effects as they both leave behind a damage over time effect. This is why we commonly see on dual wield 1 poison and 1 flame enchant. So having the damage from those boosted up to 50% higher is really strong, and it's definitely nice to run at least a charged offhand on your weapons to help take advantage of this a little more. Definitely one of the high priority passives to pick up for a DK if you're still in the process of collecting skill points and trying to figure out what to spend where. Alright, next up we have Warmth. When you deal direct damage with an Ardent Flame ability, you reduce the enemy's movement speed by 30% for 3 seconds. This is pretty nice for PvP, but not really super important for PvE DPS. So if you are running low on skill points, this is one you can hold off on. The next passive is Searing Heat. Increases the damage over time of your Fiery Breath, Searing Strike, and Dragonknight standard abilities by 25% and the duration by 4 seconds. This is another really important one as each of those abilities are strong, especially our ultimate, the Dragonknight standard, so having both the damage increase and the duration increase will improve your DPS levels quite a bit. And then finally we have World in Ruin. Increases the damage of your flame and poison attacks by 5%. Another really great passive to get and one of the higher priorities to unlock for sure. Nothing too flashy about it, just a flat damage increase to damage types that will make up a lot of our total damage. Moving on to the active skills in the Ardent Flame line. First up, we have our ultimate, which is, I would say, the best DPS ultimate in the game for any class, the Dragonknight standard. This is a really large flame AoE damage over time ability that ticks once every second for 20 seconds, and it also provides a nice damage synergy for someone in your group to hit. The morph that we'll want as a PvE DPS is the Standard of Might morph. This adds a massive 15% damage done buff, and it also reduces our damage taken by 15% while we're standing inside of the standard circle. Seeing as this ultimate lasts for 20 seconds, this is really massive, and since it is percent based, the more damage that we're doing, the bigger increase that we'll see when we're using this ultimate. So not only a really strong flame AoE for 20 seconds, but more damage to everything else and more tankiness, just an incredible ultimate overall. The only real downside is that it is stationary, so there are definitely times when you could drop it and then the boss immediately ports somewhere else or moves away, and since it is a bit expensive at 250 ultimate to cast, that can be a pretty big blow to miss out on the damage from it. So that's mostly just learning the encounters though, and when is the best time to drop your ultimate. Another plus to this is that we can slot it on the back bar since it doesn't really have any passive bonus tied to it, which allows us to slot an alternate ultimate on the front bar that does give passive damage like Flawless Dawnbreaker. So overall, this is definitely a must-have skill, one of the best ones in the game. Alright, next up, the first basic skill that we'll start with in the Ardent Flame line is Lava Whip. This is your main single target spammable that you'll use on a Dragonknight. Most of the time as a DPS, you'll want to go with the Molten Whip morph. With this morph, whenever you activate an Ardent Flame ability, a different one, not Whip, you'll gain a stack of Seething Fury, increasing the damage of your next Molten Whip by 20% and your weapon and spell damage by 100 for 15 seconds, and this can stack up to 3 times. So up to a 60% increased hit on your next whip when this is fully stacked by having this ability slotted, as long as we're casting an ability from the skill line that isn't whip at least once every 15 seconds. And we can also keep up that 300 weapon and spell damage buff from the 3 stacks. This part used to be consumed whenever we cast whip, but they changed it so that now only the bonus whip damage portion is consumed. So the weapon and spell damage will stick around as long as we're hitting one of these abilities every 15 seconds. This is really easy to pre-stack before an encounter starts, and I'll tell you how I do that later on when we cover one of the other abilities further down this skill line. Usually this will be on our front bar since spammables typically go on the front bar. However, because of that passive bonus, there are some occasions where you might be using a different spammable and you can actually run this ability on your back bar just for that passive 300 weapon and spell damage. This is not as common as using it on the front, but it's still something I find myself doing for some scenarios. You'll just need to make sure you have another ability on the back bar from the Ardent Flame line so that you can stack it up. Another thing about this morph is that it splits the cost between stamina and magicka, making it really convenient for those stamina-based Dragonites out there to still be able to use it, whereas if it was fully magicka, it would be really hard to sustain. And I've seen some magicka Dragonites complain that they run out of stam with this, but it can actually be a plus too because it ends up being a very low magicka cost skill. You just have to adjust your build to account for that additional stam drain, and I think once most people do make those adjustments, they end up feeling pretty good about the cost on the skill. I did want to briefly talk about the Flame Lash morph. This one is sometimes used. It's way more commonly seen in PvP, but it does have a nice heal attached to it. So maybe for running around doing some overland stuff and you don't want to worry about slotting a heal, this could be a nice easy way to stay alive and not worry about that. But for most PvE content, if you are looking to max out your damage, there are other ways to keep yourself alive, and you'll usually want to go with the Molten Whip morph. Alright, next up we have Searing Strike. This is a single target damage over time ability that lasts for 24 seconds. It has a decent upfront hit to it also that is single target direct damage. Then the dot that it leaves behind deals pretty good damage as well. This will generally be slotted on the front bar as it will snapshot to the weapon and spell damage and max magicka or stamina from when it's cast, so you'll get a tiny bit more usually from front barring it. However, I have seen some situations where it may be back barred, but that is not nearly as common. For picking our morphs, I'd say both have their place. However, if you are looking to get the most damage possible, Venomous Claw is the superior morph as it will ramp up in damage with each tick, making it one of the hardest hitting damage abilities in our kit so long as it is running for that full duration. For the Burning Embers morph, this still does pretty good damage, just not as much as Venomous Claw, but the big perk to this morph is that you heal for 100% of the damage done with this ability. So if you are running content without a healer or you are running solo and not using something like the Pale Order mythic, this may be a nice option for you to give up a small amount of damage in order to have a nice reliable incoming heal over time. For group content, I typically go with the Venomous Claw morph, but ultimately it's up to you depending on your specific situation. It's also really nice to have this ability to keep up our Seething Fury passive for Molten Whip. Not only will it boost up our whip damage, but our overall weapon and spell damage. Next up is Fiery Breath. Pretty similar to Searing Strike in the way that it works, except that the upfront hit is an AoE direct damage attack instead of single target, but the dot that it applies still counts as single target dots on each enemy affected. It also lasts for 24 seconds, same as Searing Strike, so you can usually pair those casts together pretty easily. And then the similarities continue as it has a poison damage morph and a flame damage morph, but the effects on these are a bit different and both can be very useful depending on what you need. Noxious Breath is the poison damage morph, and this applies Major Breach, reducing the enemy's physical and spell resistance by 5948. This is a huge debuff to have if it is not already present, so if you're solo with no one around to apply it, or maybe you are in group play, but a particular section of a fight has you split away from the group, this could be really beneficial to your damage. On the other hand, it is a pretty common debuff to have. Usually the tanks will have this taken care of, or necromancers can take care of it in an AoE with their Boneyard skill, and there's other sources as well. But that said, there are definitely still some good uses for this morph, including if you just prefer to have this skill cost stamina for you for balancing your sustain, and the debuff from the following morph is already taken care of by somebody else. So this other morph is Engulfing Flames, pretty similar to the base ability, but now you'll be applying a debuff to the enemy's hit with this where they take 6% more flame damage. This can be really nice to have at least one person in the group running this morph so that the entire group can benefit from it. So make sure that that is there when you're putting a group together. You need to account for it. Or again, if you have both debuffs covered and you just prefer some more magicka drain in your kit versus stamina drain, you don't need that Major Breach from Noxious Breath. This is a good one to run for that as well. The damage from both of these morphs on their own, it's nothing super special, but it's still usually solid to run even if you don't need the debuffs, since they do interact with Molten Whip's Seething Fury passive. However, there are definitely situations where you can drop this skill for something else that you might want to run. Again, assuming the debuffs that the morphs provide are already taken care of by other teammates. But if you do need these debuffs, this is a high priority skill. Next up in the Ardent Flame line is Fiery Grip. This is a chain that pulls enemies in, it taunts them, and it gives you major expedition for 4 seconds. The Unrelenting Grip morph is very popular for chaining in adds, usually done by a tank, but there are some scenarios where someone else might help the tank out by using this ability. The other morph though, Chains of Devastation, changes the skill up a little bit. This converts it to a gap closer where instead of pulling the enemies to you, you pull yourself to the enemy. It does remove the taunt feature, but it adds in 4 seconds of major berserk, increasing your damage dealt by 10%. For PvE use, this is pretty niche. I could see running around overland or maybe some solo type stuff with adds that are getting quickly bursted. It could be interesting, but for most cases for PvE DPS, that 4-second timer is a bit too short to be worth using within your rotation. If we did have more bar space, maybe, but I don't think it's worth giving up the other options that we have to go with. This feels more like a PvP morph to me that gives you that short 4-second burst window to blow up your enemies. And then finally, the last skill in the Ardent Flame line is Inferno. This is a single target direct damage ability that fires off 4 times over a 15-second period. So it fires off when you cast it and then again every 5 seconds after that. It also has the added benefit of giving you your major crit chance buffs for whatever bar you have it slotted on. The Cauterize morph converts this to a healing ability, so that will be more for using on a healer or for some PvP builds, but the morph we'll be taking as a PvE DPS is the Flames of Oblivion morph. This boosts it up to 3 fireballs that shoot out every 5 seconds instead of just 1. This is such a strong ability for both single target and AoE DPS, and the crit chance that it gives really allows for a lot of extra flexibility in our builds. This is also typically the ability that I'll use to precast 3 times to stack up my Seething Fury passive before combat. It's not super expensive, and it's one that you'll want to precast anyways running into an encounter, so it works perfectly for that type of usage. So you'll want to make sure that this is slotted on the same bar as your Molten Whip ability. If it is a boss fight where you're using Whip as your spammable, then you'll typically have it front barred. But if you happen to be running Whip on your back bar for certain encounters where you might be using a different spammable or you're not running Whip at all, then this is fine to run on your back bar. So that pretty much wraps up the Ardent Flame line. Lots of really important skills here. The only one that I'm not regularly using as a DPS is the Chains, but that is still an important skill for Dragonites in other areas of the game. All right, next up we have the Draconic Power line. This one is a bit more defensive overall, but still has some really strong offensive abilities as well. We'll start with our passives. Iron Skin. This increases the amount of damage you block by 10%. Not super important as a DPS, but it's still definitely a nice one to grab if you have the points for it, as sometimes you will have to block attacks, and this just lets you be a bit more tanky when doing so and ups your chances of survival. Next up is Burning Heart. While a Draconic Power ability is active, your healing received is increased by 12%. Again, not super important to have as a DPS, as we often won't have one of these abilities active on us to take advantage of this passive. But there are some cases where you might, and this is just a free extra 12% healing received, so if you do have the extra skill points, you might as well have it unlocked. Definitely a must-have for PvP and for tanking though. And then the next passive is Elder Dragon. Increases your health recovery by 5% for each Draconic Power ability slotted. Increases the range of your melee attacks by 2 meters. So the first part of that is not super relevant for us as a DPS, as we don't really care that much about health recovery, but the second part is pretty huge and actually makes it one of the best passives in the Dragonites kit. Having your melee range improved from 5 meters to 7 meters is honestly a game changer. It really allows for a lot more flexibility in movement and positioning, and whenever I swap off of a DK to a different class, I definitely feel the difference. I'll be honest, I kind of wish that 7 meters was just the standard across all classes, as it just feels a lot better overall, but as it is now, DKs are the ones that get to enjoy that benefit. And then finally we have Scaled Armor. Increases your physical and spell resistance by 1650. This comes out to just about 2.5% reduced damage, so nothing too crazy, but it's free damage mitigation, so definitely a nice passive to pick up. For our ultimate, we have the Dragon Leap. This is a pretty iconic DK ability. Unfortunately, it's not super useful for PvE DPS. The Take Flight morph reduces the cost and increases the damage and the range. And then the Ferocious Leap morph makes it deal flame damage instead of physical. And then you also get a health scaling shield after the leap lands. These are definitely more common for PvP or just having some fun running around the overland, but not too great for DPS to run usually. It is pretty funny to bust one of these out in group content though, and surprise everyone that's not used to seeing it. On to the first skill in the Draconic Power line, we have Spiked Armor. This gives us our major resolve, adding 5948 armor, and it also acts as a Thorns ability where damage is returned to the enemies that attack us. This Thorn damage scales with our physical and spell resistance. So as a DPS, unless we're solo, we usually aren't getting attacked enough to really make good of that secondary part there, and our resistances are not really usually super high to get that tooltip up very high anyways. If you don't have a source of major resolve, this can be nice to have going to add in some extra resistances. It comes out to about 9% damage reduction to incoming attacks. However, in organized group play, you'll often have a Warden casting the Frost Cloak ability, which will give you the same buff. And then for a lot of content, even if you don't have this buff active, it's usually not the end of the world. You might not even be taking that much damage to begin with, but there are some niche encounters where this might be beneficial for you. Definitely a popular choice for other gameplay modes. Just as a PvE DPS, it isn't usually a super important ability to have going. For the morphs, they both have their uses. The Hardened Armor morph adds in a shield when you cast it, so kind of doubling down on the defensive nature of the skill. This is a health scaling shield, and it's about the same size shield as you'd get from something like Bone Shield in the Undaunted line. And then for the other morph, Vault to Armor, this adds an additional damage component to the skill where it sprays out spikes around you and adds a damage over time for 20 seconds to any enemy's hit. So this could be useful if you want the damage resistance from the skill, but you don't want to completely give up having a damage ability slotted. However, the damage is pretty low on this as it also scales off of your resistances, not your offensive stats. Alright, the next ability in this line is one of my favorites, Dark Talons. This deals a nice upfront flame damage hit and holds non-elite enemies in place. It also provides a synergy for allies to use that will work for the non-elite enemies held in place as well. The morph we'll be taking as a damage dealer is the Burning Talons morph. This also causes the skill to deal more flame damage as damage over time for 4 seconds. The upfront hit is AoE direct, but the damage over time applied counts as a single target dot on each enemy hit. This is one of my favorite abilities in the game. It's super satisfying to use from a thematic point of view, but it also just hits really hard and helps break up the monotony of the long duration dots in the Dragonknight's toolkit. It is a bit rough on Magicka sustain, especially if you're playing as a stamina-based Dragonknight. I don't really have any issues sustaining it for AoE damage encounters or if I'm using a spammable other than Whip, but in conjunction with Whip, it can be a bit rough for a Stam DK to keep up. Magicka-based Dragonknights should have no real issues with it though, and it should pretty much be one of those abilities that you try to slot everywhere you can for DPS. Another really nice thing about this skill is that since the dot ticks every 1 second, you can recast it early for that nice upfront hit and you don't miss out on any of your dot ticks. This isn't the case for other dots that have 2-second intervals, as that dot portion will get delayed every time that you recast them. But with Talons, you'll keep getting that dot tick even if you spam this, and the upfront hit is the same as your typical AoE spammable, so it's a great one to recast early if you have multiple dots expiring at the same time. Overall though, really strong skill here for both AoE and single target damage. The only real downside is that high cost paired with the short duration. Next up, we have Dragon Blood. This is a self-heal that heals you for 33% of your missing health. You also gain Major Fortitude, increasing your health recovery by 30% for 20 seconds. Having this active also counts towards that Burning Heart passive that increases your healing received by 12%. So as a DPS, if you do need a self-heal, the morph that we'll be taking is Coagulating Blood. Funny enough, this is actually generally the better tanking morph as well, aside from a few niche scenarios. But this morph changes it to a heal that scales with your offensive stats, then has a secondary function to it that increases by up to 50% additional healing based on your missing health. So the lower your health when you cast it, the more bonus heal that you'll get. It's a really nice oh crap button. This isn't one I have slotted super often, but it is there as an option if you need a burst heal. Alright, the next skill is Protective Scale. This reduces the damage you take from projectiles by 50% for 6 seconds. I actually remember using this the first time I ever completed Veteran Maelstrom Arena a long time ago. My first clear was on a Stam DK, and I remember this taking some pressure off for a few of the rounds. I think the skill worked a little differently back then. I don't remember the exact details of it, but you really don't see this one commonly run nowadays on a PvE DPS. But I guess if you did want to run it, the Dragonfire Scale morph could be interesting for some niche scenarios where you are taking a lot of projectiles at once. This would potentially deal a fair amount of damage back to the attacker since the flame damage can shoot out once every half second. But I'd say this is probably a solo only thing, and even then, not too many situations where it would come in handy. And then the final skill in the Draconic Power line is Inhale. This deals a low upfront hit and heals for that damage caused. So the more enemies you hit with that upfront hit, the more healing you're going to get. And then after 2.5 seconds, it deals another hit of flame damage. This one more in line with a traditional AoE spammable hit. So the two parts added together actually end up dealing pretty good damage for this. So if we take that deep breath morph, then we'll also interrupt any enemies that are casting when we initially cast this ability. And then that secondary hit gets boosted up even higher than it was originally, so it hits harder than a regular AoE spammable. So this is actually a really strong damage skill for AoE DPS. It's even pretty good just for single target damage, but when you start looking at the cost of casting this every 3 seconds and Talons every 4 seconds, plus finding the bar space for that and also using your whip, you don't really see it too often for purely single target fights. But for AoE, it is pretty incredible. Even on a Stam DK, I put this in my trash builds. Not only does it hit really hard, but it's a nice emergency heal too, as long as you have enemies to hit. I have seen some solo setups use the other morph, Draw Essence. This would bring down that cost quite a bit, and you get a bit more healing from it as well, but you do lose out on the damage from that secondary hit. It doesn't get boosted up. So I don't really think there'd be a scenario where I'd run this morph for group play. Deep Breath is just so good, it's hard to pass up. All right, that wraps up the Draconic Power line, and now we'll move on to the Earthen Heart skills. Let's start off with the passives. Eternal Mountain, this increases the duration of your Earthen Heart abilities by 20%. I'll be honest, I'm not really a huge fan of these types of passives that don't do anything except extend the duration. I feel like the duration could just be baked into the skill itself, and then that would open up the passive slots for something a little more unique and creative. But alas, it is here and it's extra time on your skills, so make sure to grab this one. Next up is Battle Roar. When you cast an ultimate ability, you restore 50 health, 50 magicka, and 50 stamina for each point of the ultimate spent. This is pretty huge for the Dragonknight sustain, and having an ult ready can be the difference in running out of resources or not. And since it does have that health on there as well, you can sometimes work in an ultimate as an emergency heal if you don't have one slotted. It is based on ultimate spent, not the cost of the ultimate, so if you have gone a little beyond the cost of the ultimate you have saved up, you will get a little bit more benefit there. Overall, this is a pretty great passive for sustain, and it synergizes really well with the Pillager's Prophet set if you have someone running that in your group, as you'll get more ultimates off. Next passive is Mountain's Blessing. When you cast an Earthen Heart ability, you and your group gain Minor Brutality for 20 seconds, increasing your weapon damage by 10%. If you are in combat, you also generate 3 ultimate. This effect can occur once every 6 seconds. Another really good passive to have here, especially if there are no other Dragonites in the group. 10% extra weapon damage is pretty huge, and that extra bit of ult gained is just icing on the cake. And then finally, we have Helping Hands. When you cast an Earthen Heart ability with a cost, you restore 1120 stamina. This effect cannot activate when you use a stamina costing ability and must cost more than the restored value. So as a DPS, this one is actually not too important to pick up anymore. It used to work when we cast our Eruption ability, which we'll go over in just a bit, but since that has no upfront cost, they changed the wording on this passive to no longer allow the stam return when using that. So this is generally better for other roles now, such as tanking, based on the skills that are in this line that we'd use to activate it. I would like to see something else added to this passive in the future, maybe to make it a bit more universal. For the active skills, we'll start with the ultimate. We have Magma Armor. This is 12 seconds of pretty close to invincibility, as it limits all incoming damage to only 3% of your max health, and it also deals a small amount of flame damage in an AoE around you. Both morphs of this are pretty interesting. The Corrosive Armor morph is definitely the more popular PvP option, as it allows your direct damage attacks to ignore enemy armor. This can be amazing in PvP, as your enemies will often have really high armor amounts that you can't quite get all the way through with penetration alone, but for PvE, you're generally planning for a specific armor pin amount already and not relying on this ultimate to get through that armor, so it isn't really nearly as attractive there. The other morph, Magma Shell, is pretty nice as well. This keeps it more similar to the base morph, except that you now throw out a damage shield to your allies, a pretty big damage shield. It covers their full health bar, so near invincibility for you and a nice damage shield for your teammates. Still, overall, pretty niche when you'd use something like this in PvE as a damage dealer. Our standard of Might ultimate is just so good for damage, it's hard to pass up. But if you are playing things a bit safer and there's a particular section of a fight you want to be able to not sweat over too much, this can be a pretty interesting option there. It's definitely a common option for tank roles, but for DPS, you don't see it nearly as often. All right, the first skill we'll unlock in the Earthen Heart line is Stone Fist. This is a stamina-based, spammable ability. The initial cast deals damage in an AoE around you, and then your next 3 casts of it shoot out balls of debris at your enemy. Yeah, debris. The Magicamorph Obsidian Shard converts this to a healing ability, so we won't really use that as a DPS. The other morph, though, Stone Giant, is pretty interesting. This adds a unique debuff called Stagger, which causes enemies to take 65 more damage per stack up to 3 stacks, so 195 at the max. And this 195 is added to every tick of every ability that the enemy takes damage from, so it's a very nice group-wide benefit for having this skill going. If you do have a Dragonknight tank that is confident in keeping this up, that is definitely the meta option for running this skill. However, that can be quite stressful, especially on some of the more difficult encounters in the game, so having a DPS run this instead can be a viable option. Honestly, I don't really have too many complaints about this skill other than that 0.6 second cast time that you get every 4 casts when you initially activate the skill. It's really clunky feeling and it just takes away from the overall enjoyment of running it. If it wasn't for that, if it was just smooth instant casts, I think this skill would be a lot better received, but ultimately it is still a nice skill to provide the debuff for your group if it's needed. Otherwise, Whip is definitely the superior spammable option to go with. The next skill is Molten Weapons. This is a group-wide major sorcery and brutality buff, so you give your group major and minor brutality. It's really nice to have this on a DK. So usually it's best suited to put this on a support role such as a Dragonknight tank, but if you don't have one of those in your group, it's still really nice to try to squeeze this onto your skill bar for your teammates. The Igneous Morph boosts this up to a crazy long 72 seconds, so it's super easy to keep up. And then for the other morph Molten Armaments, you'll only really take this one if you are doing a heavy attack build and you're not using the Oakensoul mythic. Really awesome, unique skill though overall. It's definitely one that you want someone in the group to have going. All right, next up is Obsidian Shield. This is kind of the first skill we're really getting to out of all the Dragonknight skills where I'm like, yeah, I don't really ever run this as a DPS. This is a common option for PvP and for tanking, but not really for PvE DPS. And then next up is Petrify. Kind of the same deal here. Very popular PvP skill, but not really going to be running this one on a PvE DPS. And then finally, the last skill in this line is Ash Cloud. The base morph and the Cinderstorm morph both heal. So as a DPS, we say nah to those and we take Eruption instead. This is a really strong AoE damage over time ability with a nice strong upfront hit to it as well. It is pretty unique in that it has no upfront cost to it, but instead drains a small amount of magicka for every second that it's active. And since there is no upfront cost, they've limited that upfront portion of the ability to only be able to deal damage once every 10 seconds, which is probably fair, otherwise you'd have a free AoE spammable ability. Really great skill overall though, does a ton of damage. I pretty much never take this one off of my bar as a Dragonknight DPS. I use it for AoE and for single target. It's easy to have on your back bar for pretty much any encounter, and it just gives great results. But that is it for the Dragoknight's kit. It's pretty amazing. I think it's one of the most impressively put together class kits in the game. It just feels really complete and well-rounded. Now, obviously, like any class, we don't only slot Dragonknight abilities, but I won't be covering every single other skill line in this video. I thought I would give some example bar setups, though, for some of the loadouts that I commonly use. This won't be all-encompassing, but hopefully it'll give you some good ideas and bases to work from, and then you can adjust as you need for your scenario. To start off, this one here is probably the most common setup you'll see for practicing on the trial dummy if you're trying to qualify for a guild or just trying to see how high you can push it with practice. This is really strong single target DPS and pretty close to what I'd use in actual content as well for more you're just stand and parse fights, but there are some things that I might swap around, which I'll get into. So you'll notice we don't have Engulfing Flames or Noxious Breath slotted here. This is because the trial dummy has both of those debuffs already present, and Burning Talons is a little bit better for damage than those abilities are. You can totally slot Noxious here if you're a Stam DK and you can't sustain Talons, or really either morph here if you just don't want to mess with casting Talons every 4 seconds. For single target damage, it really won't make a huge difference. For the back bar, you'll see that we have Degeneration slotted here. This is so that we have our major sorcery and brutality buffs. Now, I mentioned earlier that Igneous Weapons is a great skill for this if the buff is not provided. So if your whole group needs that, I definitely slot that instead. But for just practice focusing on the dummy, it's better to use a skill that provides those buffs that also deals damage. Now, for adjusting this for a trial, if you do have a tank or somebody else already providing those major brutality and sorcery buffs, you can definitely swap out Degeneration for something else. Something that I'll commonly do is put Deadly Cloak on my front bar for that nice 20% AoE damage taken reduction, and it also deals good damage too. And then I can move Barbed Trap to the back bar in place of Degeneration. Or if you wanted to or needed to run Noxious Breath or Engulfing, you'll have a little more room to run that as well. You could do that on the front bar, or if you want to keep Deadly Cloak and Talons, you could run those on the back bar. And then we have Camo Hunter here on the back bar. This is just for that passive damage boost and the crit chance increase. Since we are getting the crit chance from our Flames of Oblivion slotted on the front bar, if you do really need the bar space for something in particular, you can drop this. You're just going to have a bit lower crit chance on your back bar. If you're running a two-handed back bar, your Stampede skill actually has a guaranteed chance to crit. So it's not the end of the world, as you'll still be critting on that. So it's not a complete loss. But if you have room for it, it is nice to have it here to make sure that your crit chance is as high as possible. Now you don't have to do two-handed either, so here's a common setup with a staff back bar. I really like the 15-second Wall of Elements morph if I'm using a Maelstrom staff. It synergizes really well with the increased ticks and allows us to have more time on our front bar to be dealing damage there. And it also lines up really well with anti-cavalry caltrops, which is also 15 seconds. And then all the same principles apply here as we just talked about with the two-handed options. If you don't need Degeneration, feel free to swap stuff around and work in Deadly Cloak or whatever other skills you're wanting. And then here is if you have a bow on the back bar. It's pretty much the same, except we have Endless Hail and Poison Injection. And this setup could work for the Maelstrom bow or the Master's bow, either one. Maelstrom seems like a little more AoE DPS, and the Master's bow a little more single target DPS. And then finally, here's a pretty standard setup for using dual wield on the back bar. This might be if you just want the extra mitigation from using the Black Rose Prison dual wield. So as a general rule of thumb, I'll often do the Maelstrom staff back bar for encounters where I want a bit more cleave damage. And then for more single target focused fights, I'll often do a two-hander on the back bar, usually with a proc set like Pillar of Nirn on the back bar instead of doing an arena set. Maelstrom two-hander is okay, but it's generally outperformed by using a combination where you back bar a 5-piece set and front bar a different 5-piece set to allow room for both a mythic and a monster set. So those were more for single target encounters. For AoE scenarios, I do change my skills up a good bit. I like the staff on the back bar, like I said. Wall is just a really nice large AoE. However, depending on the scenario, I do use two-handed sometimes to zoom around the battlefield with Stampede. I think that can definitely have its benefits. But the front bar for me is pretty much always the same. Camo Hunter here for that crit chance buff. This could also be Inner Light if you are a Magicka-based Dragonknight and you're reliably getting Minor Berserk from someone in your group. The difference is rather small between the two though. For Stamina Dragoknights, definitely Camo Hunter there. And then I like to run Burning Talons, Deep Breath, and Whirling Blades as my main 3 active skills that I use. So typically I'll precast the Channeled Acceleration on the back bar for the crit damage, stack up my Flames of Oblivion to 3 stacks for the Seething Fury passive if I have the whip slotted, and then I'll just cast it once otherwise if whip is not slotted on my bar. But then I'll precast Deadly Cloak. All of this before I enter the fight. So like as I'm running up to the enemies, I'll be doing this. And then I start the rotation with Wall and Eruption, or Eruption and then Wall if I'm further out, since Eruption has a nice large range on it. So I can kind of like throw that in as I'm running up and then hit my wall. Kind of just depends on the situation. But after that, I'll cast my Talons, Deep Breath, and then work in Whirling Blades. And then just keep recasting Talons and Deep Breath as they run out. And then towards the very end, when enemies' health is low, I'll just spam Whirling Blades. Really just an enormous amount of AoE damage with this setup. I've been really happy with this for a while now. Also, I wanted to point out, if you do have the ability to cast Channeled Acceleration and then swap it off of your bar for something else, since it lasts 60 seconds, Proxy Det can be really nice for larger ad packs, but that is just a little bit sweatier thing to do if you feel like messing with it. And then if you are in charge of Engulfing Flames, you may need to drop Whip off of your back bar to make room for that. Or again, like I just said, you could pre-buff Channeled Acceleration and swap it off to make room for Engulfing. And then for boss encounters that require a ton of AoE, I usually do a pretty similar setup, but I prefer to sometimes use silver shards in place of whirling blades. Both of them work really well, but I usually do the whirling blades for more like short burst AoE trash stuff, and then silver shards for boss encounters that just need a lot of AoE. I do also have some more setups as well as my full build info on my website at skinnycheeks.gg. It has all my favorite gear combos, some additional skill bar loadouts, champion points, all of that stuff, not just for Dragonites, but for all of the other classes as well. And as soon as Arcanist is available, I'll have an updated page for them as well. But I will say one of the best things that you can do if you're wanting to figure out a good bar setup is to go to ESO logs and then find the particular encounter that you're trying to build for. But don't just look at the top performing one and pick that with no questions asked. There could be quite a lot that goes into that person's reasoning on why they chose their setup, and there might be things going on there that you don't realize. So look at like the top 10 to 15 or so for your class, see which skills that they all have in common, and that's usually a pretty good indicator of a baseline for those essential skills for that fight. And then you can kind of play around that based on what your group is doing specifically. Also, feel free to ask here as well if you have questions here in the comments section, or if you want to join my Discord server. We have discussions going on daily around all aspects of the game. The link to that will be in the description of the video. But that's going to do it for this one. A little bit different style of video for me from what I've done in the past. So hopefully you guys found this to be helpful to get the most out of your Dragonknight as a damage dealer. I had a lot of fun putting this together. Let me know if you'd like to see more of this style of video for other classes as well. Depending on how this all goes, I may do some more of these deep dives into skill lines, or I might just stick with the more traditional build video styles. I'm not sure yet. We'll see. But thanks so much for stopping by. I want to give a shout out to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members. The contributions help a ton to keep the website and YouTube channel going. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Cougars Bay and the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, Iffy, Blake1816, Mordecai1212, Santanico, Vidridi, Florian, Phoenix, Nalandia, Unemployed, Chryseliana, Cha-Cha, and Technical KO. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.